Welcome to the Metapolitical Podcast, where we analyze politics beyond ideology, focusing on what is, not what should be. This is your host, Jim Chikiko. Today's episode is about personal finance, specifically personal finance advice and financial literacy rhetoric. Now, I'm not here to tell you whether budgeting is good or bad or whether you should or shouldn't save money. What I want to do here instead is deconstruct how economic struggles get framed as individual problems requiring individual solutions, and what that framing reveals about how we think about economics and responsibility in political discourse. You've probably heard all of this before. You're told to budget better, cut unnecessary spending, increase your income, save more, invest wisely, build an emergency fund. It is a whole list that you have to get through. Financial literacy has become the proposed solution to economic hardship. Politicians promote it, schools are encouraged to teach it. The underlying message here is that if people just knew how to manage money better, they wouldn't be struggling so hard. But the thing is, that laundry list of things you have to do to get your personal finance in order is chock full of assumptions. The first assumption is that the problem is fundamentally about knowledge or discipline, not material conditions. The framing suggests that if you're struggling, it's because you don't know how to manage your money properly, or that you lack the discipline to stick to a budget. It's not that you don't earn enough or that things cost too much. It's that you haven't learned the right techniques or developed the right habits. Dave Ramsey tells you to cut up your credit cards or put your money in envelopes. Follow the debt snowball method. Sue Zorman is convinced that people who can't save are making emotional decisions instead of rational ones. Robert Kiyosaki talks about assets versus liabilities and making your money work for you. So there is quite a bit of consistency in the messaging there, that there are techniques to learn, habits to develop, and systems to implement. You have the 50-30-20 rule, 23-8, it's a bunch of strings and numbers that are turned into rules that sometimes make sense, sometimes don't. These techniques are not wrong in and of themselves, but you will notice that they all have something in common, which is that they assume that the problem is you don't know these methods or you're not disciplined enough to follow them. The issue is framed as a knowledge gap or a discipline gap instead of an income gap or a cost structure problem. The second assumption is that individual behavior is the primary variable that needs changing. It's not the wages or the costs, not policy. It's you and your choices, your spending patterns, your financial decisions. The spotlight is on your behavior as the thing that can and should be adjusted. This dovetails perfectly into a third assumption that economic outcomes are determined mainly by personal choices. If you're doing well financially, it's because you made good choices, and if you're struggling, it's because you made bad ones. This creates a direct causal link between individual decision-making on one hand and economic outcomes, while downplaying or ignoring everything else that might affect those outcomes. And this is where financial literacy becomes a virtue of some kind. Being financially literate suddenly becomes a moral quality, a sign of responsibility, if you will, of maturity and good character. People who budget are responsible, people who save are disciplined, people who invest are wise, and by extension, people who struggle financially, on the flip side, are irresponsible, undisciplined, and unwise. So here, financial outcomes become moral outcomes. Your bank account balance tells a bigger story than just how much money you have. It becomes a reflection of your character too. It's quite a leap, actually, because it moves the conversation from, do you have enough, to, are you a good person who makes good choices? Struggle turns into shame somehow because it's evidence of personal failing. Success, on the other hand, becomes virtuous. It's evidence that you're doing things right and that you deserve what you have. The structural context, things like what you were born into, what opportunities were available, what the labor market looked like, and what policy environment you're operating in, all of that kind of just fades into the background. What's foregrounded here is your individual virtue or lack thereof, as demonstrated by your financial situation. And the final assumption that personal finance makes is that education or information is really what's missing from the equation, that people struggle financially because they don't know better. That if we just taught everyone how to budget and how to save and invest, the problem would just solve itself. The solution is more financial literacy education, more workshops, more tools and apps and, spreadsheets to track spending. Information is framed as the missing ingredient, the intervention that needs to be made. Combined, these assumptions do a lot of heavy lifting in pathologizing and moralizing financial outcomes. They divide people into the responsible and the irresponsible. It's a column A, column B thing. They frame economic struggle as personal failure rather than a broader systemic condition. Framing personal finance into a kind of individual pathology serves to obscure quite a lot of things, actually. It brackets the conversation on wage stagnation, for starters. For decades, wages for most workers have remained relatively flat when adjusted for inflation. And on the other hand, costs for essentials like housing, education, healthcare, those things have increased dramatically. A dollar today doesn't buy what a dollar bought 30 years ago, but wages really haven't kept pace with that reality. So when we're talking about budgeting and bean counting, that's time that's not spent talking about wages. In personal finance, wages really only factor in as a kind of base from which to start your budget, or perhaps in terms of something that you can increase by getting a promotion or getting a new job. But wages in general as a market component, that's a conversation that just doesn't really happen at all. And speaking of wages, what about the gap between productivity and wages? Those two decoupled decades ago. Worker productivity has increased substantially. They're producing more value per hour than ever before, but wages haven't increased proportionally. Where did those gains go? Who captured that value? These are questions about distribution of wealth, about economic structure, and about who benefits from growing productivity. Personal finance advice, it's not really interested in these questions. And then there are the real structural factors that we tend to ignore when we take the problem to the individual level. Policy decisions about labor laws, minimum wage, housing development, zoning, healthcare funding, these shape the economic landscape that people are trying to navigate. Labor market conditions, like the decline of unions, the rise of contract work, elimination of pensions, shift from full-time to part-time employment, these are not individual choices. Housing supply, whether there's enough affordable housing being built, what kind of housing and where, this is a policy and market question, not personal behavior. But again, personal finance discourse doesn't engage with any of this. Personal finance is heavily interested in individual behavior because it's straightforward. Personal behavior is easier to change than policy. You can adjust your budget today. You can cut spending this week. You can start tracking expenses right now. Policy change, on the other hand, it's slow, contested, and difficult. There is a whole political procedure that it follows to enact any kind of change. It requires political will, coalition building, legislative action. It takes time, and there's no guarantee of success. But see, the thing is, just because behavior is easier to change doesn't mean it's the only thing that we should focus on or that it's the root of the problem. Easy doesn't mean correct. Easy doesn't mean sufficient. If the issue is fundamentally structural, if wages are inadequate or costs are too high, then focusing exclusively on behavior because it's the accessible lever is treating the symptom while ignoring the disease. It's like telling someone to manage their fever better instead of addressing the infection that's causing it. I mean, sure, you can take measures to reduce the fever, and those measures might help you feel better temporarily. but you haven't solved the underlying problem. If you were to distill all of personal finance into one line, I think what you'll end up with is living within your means. But here's a question. What does it mean to live within your means when life itself is beyond your means? When rent, food, healthcare, transportation, when they cost more than you earn, what exactly are you supposed to cut? The phrase living within your means assumes there's some kind of viable baseline that survival is affordable if you just make the right choices. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if the means themselves are insufficient? Not only does personal finance assume that you have enough to cover the bases, it also assumes that there's a little bit more to keep for yourself. That if you just manage correctly, you can cover necessities and even build savings. But this assumption, it breaks down when we look at actual income versus actual costs for a significant portion of the population. This advice presumes a mathematical possibility that may not exist for a lot of people. What is also really interesting about personal finance is because it is so localized, it ignores the broader system altogether. If you try to integrate all the wisdoms that form the personal finance framework into that system, that is when you realize that it has a scalability problem. Personal finance advice assumes that you're optimizing your position within an unchanged system. It's advice for individual positioning, if you will. It only works if very few of you do it. If everybody follows this advice and starts doing the same thing, then it stops working. Let's go through some examples to see how unscalable personal finance really is. First, there's the paradox of thrift. This is a well-established economic concept. If everybody decides to save more and spend less, what actually happens? So first, consumption is going to go down. Businesses are going to see that and cut production. So then they lay off workers, incomes fall, and then unemployment rises. The very thing people were trying to protect themselves against, financial insecurity, it gets worse because everybody tried to protect themselves at the same time. So here, individual rationality becomes collective irrationality. The advice to save more only works in a context where others continue to spend. This is the kind of thing that cannot be universalized. There's also investment returns. A common piece of financial advice is to build wealth through investments to generate passive income. But where do those returns come from? They come from economic activity, from consumption, growth, from other people's labor and spending. If everyone just saved cash and didn't invest, there would be no returns to capture. And if everyone invested but nobody consumed, the companies you're invested in would have no customers. Your passive income requires other people's active economic participation. The strategy assumes you're extracting value from a system that continues to function because not everybody's doing what you're doing. And then there's the usual advice telling you to make your shovel bigger, get a better job, work harder, get a promotion, increase your income. That's the bottom line. That sounds reasonable at the individual level, but it collapses the more you think about it. First, there's a limited number of high paying roles. Also, not everybody can be promoted, not everybody can be management. Corporate hierarchy will always require people to fill those bottom spots. There are always going to be bottom spots on that ladder. And if everybody decided to work harder, that would just basically reestablish the baseline for what qualifies as hard work. Then you're back where you started and you're going to have to work harder than everybody else, who, by the way, is also trying to work harder than you. The last example that we're going to talk about is geographic arbitrage. When they tell you if you can't afford to live where you are, move somewhere cheaper. Again, that works individually, but what happens when enough people do this? Housing prices in the cheaper area are going to rise. Cost of living is going to go up with that. The arbitrage opportunity disappears. And also, this strategy assumes that economic activity continues in the expensive areas people are leaving. If everybody moved to low cost areas, those areas would either become expensive or lack economic opportunity. High cost of living areas are high economic opportunity areas. That's why everybody wants to live there. And that's why they're willing to pay the price so they can seize the opportunity that comes with it. So, again, what these examples tell us is that personal finance advice only works until enough people do it, and then it collapses under its own weight. The solutions are predicated on not being universal. The appeal of personal finance is in the fact that it offers solutions that only work because not everyone can follow them. What it ends up doing is it shifts the political conversation away from wages and policy and systemic factors toward behavior and individual education. It depoliticizes economic outcomes. Struggle is personal and it needs to be solved at the individual level rather than a collective condition that needs to be addressed politically. The way it is now, personal finance discourse removes pressure for wage increases, for policy changes, and for wealth redistribution. It makes economic anxiety something you're supposed to solve on your own through better choices and more knowledge. And because the advice is technically correct at the individual level, sure, budgeting helps, saving helps, it's hard to argue against without sounding like you're dismissing personal responsibility entirely. But there's a difference between acknowledging that personal finance matters at the individual level and pretending that financial literacy is the answer to systemic economic problems. One is about optimizing within constraints, and the other is about asking whether or not those constraints themselves are reasonable or necessary. This is not about telling people that they shouldn't budget or save. It's recognizing that material conditions do matter, that structural factors do exist, and that when large numbers of people are struggling financially despite working full time, sometimes even multiple full time jobs, despite being educated or making reasonable choices, then maybe the problem isn't primarily one of financial literacy. We must acknowledge that personal finance discourse is doing a lot of political and ideological work. It is not neutral, it's a way of understanding economic reality that privileges certain explanations and obscures others. Recognizing that is the first step to seeing what else might be true. And that brings us to the end of the episode. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.